What an amazing first day of the final of the Skilling Open between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So. There were blunders, there was brilliance, there was despair, and there was triumph. Let me give you a taste of what happened today. What I'm going to do is take you through how the first 3 games finished, and then I'll look at the 4th game in its entirety. So, without further ado, game 1, Carlsen with white. He was better for most of this game, but Wesley is hanging on. You can see that there are bishops of opposite colour, and that makes it difficult, for example, for this pawn to advance. But Carlsen is a little bit better, and his rook is active, threatening a couple of pawns. Wesley played pawn to a4. And now Carlsen could take this, and they would go into a rook and pawn endgame, but black has pretty good drawing chances in this kind of endgame. Decent drawing chances with black having the active rook. But Carlsen found a really tricky idea. He played g5 check, luring the king away from the pawn. Rook takes pawn check. And now that king should go back here. But this is still a little bit tricky. White is a pawn up, and that's quite a passed pawn. But black has pretty decent drawing chances with the opposite coloured bishops. That's what Wesley should have done. Instead, after this check, he interposed with the rook. Perhaps anticipating that Carlsen would exchange rooks, and then that's a dead draw. But watch what happened. This was a brilliant piece of calculation by the world champion. Watch what happened. Rook takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop is forced. Now, if pawn takes pawn, then rook e5 will lead to a drawn endgame. But Carlsen had found this move, e7, threatening to make a queen. If the rook comes here, then rook b5. No problem at all. You deflect the rook away, and then the pawn rolls home. So after e7, Wesley had to take on a2. Both sides made a queen. Now, with all this firepower on the board and both kings exposed, well, this is pretty chancy, but it's crucial who has the first shot in this duel, and Carlsen has the first shot. Incredibly, he can force a win with this move, and he'd calculated this out right at the start. The king cannot reach safety. It's unbelievable, even with these pieces around it. So, for example, if queen f6, then this move wins. Well, for example, I mean, there are other continuations, but that will do the job. That's checkmate. So after queen e7 check, king h6. Rook h4, check. The rook has to interpose. Now you've got to get this check right. Queen f8 check. If the king steps out, queen f4 is mate. So the queen comes back to g7. It's a right gum up of pieces now. Queen f4 check. Forcing g5. That opens up the 6th rank. Queen d6 check. Queen g6 forced. Queen f8. We're back there again. What a merry-go-round. Queen has to step in the way. And now rook h5 check. That was the final move of the game. Of course, if king takes rook, we have queen takes queen. And if king g6, we can take there and we're going to win the queen. Wow, what a finish. And brilliantly calculated by Magnus way back. So, first blood to Carlsen. Let's go into game 2. Well, this was absolutely wild. Wesley had a winning position, but failed to spot the right idea. Well, you can see this is after move 88. The queens are still on the board. Carlsen's king has been checked around the board. But by this stage, it's looking like a draw. Wesley knew that if he exchanged queens here, that's just a dead draw. The king can just stay in the corner and the bishop can sack itself for this pawn. But he tried one last chance. Queen e3 check. The king could just step here and black is safe. It'll be a draw. But incredibly, Carlsen played king f8, allowing, well, I think, quite a simple mating routine. The king was chased up the board. Again, it's a funny merry-go-round. That was the final move, because if king f4, queen f5, mate. I cannot remember the last time I saw the world champion fall into, well, I think a very simple checkmate. Of course, he was short of time. But this is a really simple one to spot because, you know, all these checks, I mean, it's all forced. It's all terribly simple. Extraordinary. And well, Magnus was absolutely kicking himself after falling into that. So, 1-1 after 2 games. We went into game 3 and Carlsen, well, just played so aggressively in the opening and just took the initiative, threw his kingside pawns up the board. Wesley managed to escape to an endgame and he's blockaded those pawns with the king and rook. Nevertheless, this is a winning position for white, and now Carlsen did a switchback with the rook. c5, rook e3. If the rook breaks through, if you dislodge the king, then these pawns are going to roll through. Rook d6. Pawn takes pawn. The rook had to move to the side. And now rook d1. That was the final move of the game. Rook d6 is threatened. And then white is going to break through. Or these pawns are going to roll through. I mean, it's a really hopeless situation for Wesley. So, completely convincing win by Carlsen. Very, very impressive indeed. So, after 3 games, it was 2-1 to Carlsen. They went into the 4th game. Let me show you the whole of the 4th game. Wesley had to win this one to tie the set 2-2. Carlsen just needed a draw. Carlsen started out with a Sicilian, and he was obviously happy to go, well, into this really sharp Sveshnikov variation, which of course he employed in the 2018 World Championship match. Can't believe it. 2 years ago. Almost exactly this time of year, 2 years ago. Wesley went in for this. Now, bishop g5 is kind of the old main line. But Wesley played the move that Caruana played in the World Championship match. Knight d5. Now, Carlsen has faced this, well, not only during the World Championship match in 2018, but on quite a few occasions after that. And, well, has come through with flying colours. His record with this variation as black is phenomenal. He's tried knight e7 in the past. He's also tried knight b8. He has good results with both. I think knight b8 is the most reliable. The knight looks to come to d7, and that's a nice square where it looks at the c5 square. But also, potentially later, it can hop to e5. Now, if you recall, Caruana played pawn to a4. c4 has also been seen here. But Wesley played here a really unusual move. A rare move. Must have been preparation because he didn't think for very long over it. Queen f3. So already we've got a really unusual position on the board. Has been played previously, not in so many games. So what on earth is this queen doing? Well, one of the ideas is that it's going to swing across the board, potentially to c3, potentially to a3. So bishop e7, for example, could be met by queen c3, threatening a check. And after knight a6, bishop e3 is a little bit uncomfortable for black. just threatening to take here. So Carlsen played a6. And, well, he thought for over 4 minutes over the move a6. That's quite a chunk, considering that they only had 15 minutes to start with. So queen a3 from Wesley. Okay, this is very creative. Of course, the queen sets up a pin if pawn takes knight, queen takes rook. And there are all kinds of interesting ideas here. Carlsen played b6 in order to play bishop b7 to protect that rook. And now bishop g5 from Wesley. Wow. So if queen takes bishop, then the knight will come in on on c7 with a fork. Now most games here have gone f6. And then the bishop goes back here. And white's idea is to castle on the queen side and then to advance the g-pawn and control some squares. The pawn is pretty ugly on f6. Queen is very oddly placed, but, well, it's certainly an interesting way of playing for white. But after bishop g7, bishop g5, it's been a long day. After bishop g5, Magnus thought for almost 3 minutes and played bishop e7. Well, Wesley exchanged, and now, of course, if queen takes, then knight d6 check wins a pawn. So Magnus had to play king takes bishop in order to protect the d-pawn. Well, this is quite extraordinary. So he's got his king in the middle of the board after just 12 moves. Wesley castled. Bishop b7 protects the rook and the knight fell back. Knight d7. So let's just ask the question, why did Magnus go in for this? I mean, f6 after bishop g5 wasn't so bad. Why did Magnus play like this and leave his king in the middle? Well, actually, from a strictly positional point of view, I really like black's position. Having got rid of those dark squared bishops, black controls, well, these dark squares really well. And if you could imagine an endgame, let's just remove the queens from the board, then I love black's position. Then the king would be very secure in the middle, and as usual you could play down the c-file. You could also advance perhaps with f5 as well. It looks like one of those dream Sicilian positions. The problem is the queens are still on the board, and Wesley can go for it by trying to open up the middle of the board. Good move, f4. So he just wants to crack open the centre and attack. Queen c7, connecting the rooks, fair enough. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now I would say the only problem with white's position is that this queen is very poorly placed. So Wesley rectifies that by playing queen b4, and this is a good move. I mean, if black could have 3 moves in a row, if he could play rook here and then drop the king back to g8, then I would really like black's position. That knight, such a wonderful piece in the middle, can't be driven away by any pawns. The problem for black is after queen b4, rook e8 with the idea king f8 could be met by queen h4 check, winning the h-pawn. So that means that black is going to have to improvise in order to bring that king to some kind of safety. So that's why Magnus played pawn to h5. So he's perhaps looking to bring the rook out like this. Let's see. Bishop e2. Sound development from Wesley. King f8. The king drops back. Rook f1. Looks good. Activating the rook. Rook e8. So Magnus hasn't managed to connect the rooks. Slight problem. But he is trying to get this one into play by advancing this h-pawn. So rook f5 threatens that pawn. Pawn advanced again. Rook f4. Now this is good play. So Wesley is using his lead in development, using his, well, greater space actually, to create threats. So the queen and the rook threaten to take the pawn. Now here, if knight g6, defending that, then the rook would swing across. You can see he's got using this space really well. The queen comes back and knight e4. And there is nasty pressure on that d-pawn. Yeah, this is a tricky position for black. So Magnus played queen d8. You can see he's sort of being torn in different directions here. That's queen comes back to defend the h-pawn, but it's also having to defend that b-pawn as well. It's a little bit sensitive. In fact, both those pawns are a little bit sensitive. King b1. Tucking the king away. Of course, sometimes this kind of move is possible. So rook h6 from Carlsen. Rook d4. That's a really unusual idea. We've got a lineup of the major pieces along the fourth rank threatening this pawn. And it's getting tricky. Carlsen still might be all right here. One idea, one very interesting idea, is to just jump the knight back. You can see that rook does a good job of protecting the d-pawn. And after rook takes pawn, well, rook takes pawn is a mistake actually, because after a5 that queen is going to be deflected away if queen c4, bishop a6, and yeah, that queen has to keep defending this one. So yeah, white can't take that. So knight back doesn't look bad actually. Does open up the e-file. And yeah, this is it's a creative idea basically, and maybe the queen could come into the game. Still not so clear actually. But Carlsen played h3. Wes played g3. Bishop c8. Well, I can understand why Magnus wanted to do that, bringing this bishop back into the game. It's doing nothing on b7. a4, nice move. Gives the king an escape square, but also fixes that pawn on b6. King g8, the king moves to a slightly safer square. Rook e4. Queen c7, and now rook h4. So there is still pressure here. Now Wesley looking somehow to try and open up the h-file. Let's have a look. So a5 pushes the queen away. Queen d4 and rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Can he somehow get the queen over here? It's tricky. Magnus is still probably okay, but he's got to find some good moves. Knight g6 is a good move. And after this, well, there's pressure. I would prefer white here because these pawns are just a little bit weak. But with that knight, well, you can hope for a successful defense here. But Magnus played bishop f5. Now rook h5, that's a clever little move. And that forces a decision out of this bishop. If it goes back this way, rook takes pawn, thank you. If g6, rook h6, followed by, well, our dream of getting over to the h-file, you can see how white is using this space advantage very, very well. Excellent play from Wesley. So what should black play here? This is not an easy decision. Carlsen decided, under pressure, to protect the bishop with the queen, allowing the pawn on b6 to be taken. Well, he was only thinking of activity. He wanted to activate his pieces on the e-file. He's still just about in the game after bishop g4, but, well, he's a pawn down and it's pretty bad. Instead, he played knight g4. This was a disaster. White to play. What would you play if you were white here? Bishop a6 is a killer. It just deflects the queen from protecting that bishop. If queen d7, then bishop b5. Well, it's not going well. It's not going well. So rook e1 check first. At least that gets the rook out of this line. King a2. If queen d7, then there is a very neat finish. Beautiful finish. Rook takes here. Queen check. And bishop d3. Nasty. That king never finds safety. Not true safety. So check and king a2 have just been played. Magnus played queen e8 and just gave up the bishop. But this is forlorn. Bishop b5 hits the queen. Queen e7. That was the final move of the game. What Magnus played this move and actually resigned before Wesley could make another move. The rook is attacked. Well, you can choose any way you want, really. I mean, rook f4 is pretty simple. There's nothing going on there for black, really. You could also play rook h5, threatening a check on the back rank. That's pretty nasty. And then just consolidate with bishop d3. Black is a piece down and hopelessly lost. So there we go. What a shocker. Wesley hits back in the fourth and ties the set 2-all. So they go into day 2 with everything even, all to play for. Watch out for the final set and, well, who knows, possibly a tiebreak on the final day of the final of the Skilling Open. Thanks for watching.